Housing Authority meeting. I see that's up, and I would like to call to order that same meeting, the Glendale City Council and the Glendale Housing Authority meeting of September 21st, 2010. May we have the roll call for council, please?
Council members: Draymond.
Here.
Friedman.
Here.
Quintero.
Here.
Weaver.
Here.
Mayor Najarian.
Here.
A roll call for the Housing Authority.
Authority members: Draymond.
Here.
Friedman.
Here.
Mincy.
Here.
Najarian.
Here.
Prazian.
Here.
Weaver.
Here.
Chair Quintero.
Here.
May we have your report?
The agenda for the September 21st, 2010 joint public meeting of the Glendale City Council and the Glendale Housing Authority was posted on Thursday, September 16, 2010 on the bulletin board outside City Hall. The item before you today is Director of Community Services and Parks regarding 2009-2010 Winter Shelter Program year-end report and 2010-2011 Winter Shelter Program status report. At 1A is a council motion acknowledging receipt of the report and directing staff to allow Los Angeles Homeless Services Authority, LAHSA, to release an RFP for running a winter shelter at the Armory for a 2010-2011 winter season and to explore funding assistance for a 2011-2012 winter shelter program.
Mr. Starbird.
Yes, I'll go to George Chafchin, Director of Community Services and Parks, for the report.
Thank you, Mr. Starbird. Mr. Mayor and members of the Council and Housing Authority, I'm going to just introduce this item. Staff is going to present the year-round report for the winter shelter. Two notable things in this report is the increase in the number of homeless people that we served. It went up 60% for the individuals in this area, and also the tripling of homeless families that we served in this report. In addition to the numbers, staff is going to present an option, as you know, to look at a local winter shelter and the cost for a local winter shelter. So we're going to be seeking your direction in terms of whether or not we explore that possibility for the local area. With that, I'd like to introduce Jess Duran, the Assistant Director for Community Services and Parks, and Jess and Yvette, I think, will present this together.
Thank you, George. Chairman, Mayor Najarian, members of City Council, Chairman Quintero, members of the Housing Authority. We are here today to provide you with a year-end report regarding the 2009-10 Winter Shelter Program, to recommend supporting the 2010-11 Winter Shelter Program, which is scheduled for the Glendale Armory, and to ask for direction to staff to authorize staff to work with LASA, the Los Angeles Housing Services Authority, and the County of Los Angeles, the Supervisor's Office, to explore the possible development of what we're calling a local winter shelter program. And also, we're asking you to provide direction on funding options for the development of a proposed local winter shelter program that would be for the winter season of 2011-2012, so that would be a year from now. As Mr. Starbird pointed out, the winter shelter program is a hypothermia prevention program. The program operates from December 1st to March 15th of every year. Winter shelter programs are designed and intended to serve any and all residents in need of shelter on any night. One of the goals of the Glendale Winter Shelter Program has always been to persuade guests to avail themselves of case management service such as Path Achieve Glendale and other services in the Glendale Continuum while they stay in Glendale. As you also probably know, the City of Glendale hosted a winter shelter program at the Glendale Armory for 10 consecutive years from 1997 to 2007. And it was a program administered and funded and sponsored by LASA, the Los Angeles Homeless Services Authority, under the jurisdiction of the County of Los Angeles and the Board of Supervisors. And the Winter Shelter Program is also part of a county-wide regional system. You probably also remember that for 2 years the program was relocated to the Burbank Armory, where it ran relatively smoothly the first year, ran into problems the second year. Concurrent with that, the state determined that the Burbank Armory was no longer available due to military necessity, so the program was moved back to Glendale in 9-10, which was last year. LASA subcontracted with Imago, which is a subsidiary of the Union Rescue Mission, to run the Glendale shelter. Imago subcontracts with Path Achieve Glendale to provide outreach and case management. And the City of Burbank also provided $20,000 for a transportation component to support the shelter. In terms of the number of persons that were served during the 9-10 season of the winter shelter program, it served 914 unduplicated individuals compared to 549 the year before. And in terms of families, it served 78 unduplicated families versus 27 in 2008-2009. The shelter averaged 164 persons per night. So there was a significant increase over the previous years. We would have to think that part of that is attributable to the economic recession and more families needing shelter. Of the persons served, approximately 11.16 identified themselves as being from Glendale, 3.28 identified themselves as being from Burbank, and 4.92 from Pasadena. So between the three cities, it was 19.36%. In addition, 32.82% identified themselves as being from Los Angeles, including Hollywood and North Hollywood, and the balance, or 47%, were from areas further out. During the operation of the winter shelter program, we do convene a winter shelter committee comprised of all of the departments in the City of Glendale, as well as representatives from City of Burbank and the operator, to help monitor the management of the shelter and the impacts to the community. And there are impacts to the local community, including impacts to the parks, community services and parks department, library, community redevelopment, and housing as it relates to the central business area, and police and fire. And we all work together to do the best we can to deal with those impacts, and we do deal with them. According to the police department, there is an increase in calls for service involving homeless persons during the winter shelter season, although according to these statistics, 43% of the calls were to the winter shelter and the immediate surrounding area, while 57% were to the rest of the city. And similarly, the fire department also reports an increase in calls during the winter shelter season. And of those calls, 37% were to the Armory and 63% were to the rest of the city. With regard to the planning process for the 10-11 winter shelter program, LASA did renew their contract with Imago, so Imago is scheduled to run the 10-11 winter shelter, which will open in December of this year. We do have representatives from LASA. We have the executive director of LASA, Mr. Mike Arnold, and we have representatives from Imago, should you have any questions directed to them. One option that staff explored last year and continues to explore as an alternative to the regional winter shelter program is the development of a local program which would be operated by a local service provider and would for the most part be funded outside of the LASA system. Our operational model would be smaller. Our target would be 50 beds. It would not be wholly funded by LASA, so we would have to develop our own funding sources.
I apologize, Jeff. My paper hit the microphone. Sorry.
Take blame for that one.
It was you. And a local shelter would not be part of the regional system or winter shelter program. So we could target Glendale and Burbank residences. Other benefits include that we could limit the number to 50 as opposed to 150. We could target local residents. We could provide more effective targeted case management and supportive services. We could make available housing vouchers that we have in hand, and we can limit the impact of the winter shelter program to the community if we develop our own local winter shelter program. Also, based on preliminary discussions that we have had, the local shelter would partner with Path Achieve Glendale, the Verdugo Mental Health Center, to provide outreach and counseling. The proposed program would also partner with All for Health and Health for All, who run our Pacific Park Free Health Clinic, and they would provide basic primary health care for conditions such as colds, flu, upper respiratory infections, etc. Now, the inherent challenges and the four key components that have to be addressed in order for us to be able to develop a local program are, pretty obvious. One, we have to find a service provider. So someone has to be willing to step up to the plate and collaborate with the city to run such a program. We have to find a site to host the program. We would have to obtain LASA's and county supervisors' cooperation and support, and I'll explain that in a minute. And we would have to identify funding sources to pay for a local program because, again, typically it would not be eligible to be funded by LASA as the traditional winter shelter programs are. To date, after working on this, staff has only been able to address or resolve one of those four key components. We are lucky in that we have identified a service provider that we have been meeting with that is willing to step up to the plate and collaborate with the city and is even willing to commit to some fund development to offset the operational costs, and that organization is Urban Initiatives, who have a good reputation. They are highly qualified and experienced. They are based in Pasadena and Los Angeles, and it's actually, the Urban Initiatives is actually the former Institute for Urban Research and Development, and they are very interested in working with us on a local pilot project, provided that we come up with the site, we come up with the funding, and we the city, work with LASA to get LASA support for the program. What we want to avoid in developing our local program is develop our local program, then still have LASA sponsor their program at the Armory. The goal is for our program to substitute the 150-person regional shelter at the Armory. So that's our objective. In terms of a shelter site, the city has reached out to local churches and nonprofit organizations for space for a shelter program. Thus far, we've come up empty. The shelter site would have to be able to accommodate 50 cots with case management space, a food warming kitchen, bathrooms, and shower amenities. And we haven't had anyone step up to offer that. We would be dependent upon cooperation from LASA and the county, which we haven't been able to do. We did meet with the executive director of LASA and Supervisor Antonovich is a deputy for social services. It was a very productive, constructive meeting. Yvette Samvelian, our homeless coordinator, and I made our pitch. We submitted a written proposal for our local program. We asked for cooperation in terms of whether there was any way that LASA could provide some funding for such a program. Was there any way that rather than LASA reserving the Armory for the regional program, they could reserve it for our local program since we couldn't obtain a site? And the response we got from the supervisor's office and from LASA, which is very understandable, is that this year they will not be able to support us in that fashion. What is paramount to them is they cannot lose 100 beds to our service area. Had they, and I understand that they did try, had they been able to identify another shelter, say for example Van Nuys, Sylmar, or Burbank, then they might have been able to work with us beginning this current year. But they did commit to continue to meet with us and to look at ways they could support a local program for the program year 11-12. So one of the things we're asking for is council authorization for us to go ahead and continue working with LASA and supervisor's office. In terms of the funding, it is the last piece that we need to resolve being able to put a local program together. The estimated cost to operate a 50-bed shelter for 90 days is about $151,000. Again, generally, LASA does not fund winter shelter programs that it does not sponsor and that is not part of the regional system. One goal is that Glendale and Burbank, Glendale will partner with Burbank to share in the cost of a local program, in addition to some level of fund development on the part of the operator. Other potential funding sources could include a set aside of CDBG, funds, because CDBG funds are eligible, a set aside of emergency shelter grant funds, because those funds are eligible, but probably also a commitment of general revenue funds and maybe some donations from local residents. So staff would like direction from the City Council regarding the use of any of those potential funding sources. We've also attached to our report the 2010 homeless count. In January 2010, the city conducted its annual homeless count. And as a direct recipient of continuum of care funding, we are required to conduct this count every year. Based on the homeless count, as Mr. Chopin alluded to, we did count 428 homeless persons, which compares with 258 that were counted in 2009, which represents an increase of 170. One factor for that increase is that in 2009, when we did our homeless count, the winter shelter program was in Burbank. So we only counted the 50 that boarded the bus to go to Burbank. This last year, the shelter was in Glendale, so we were able to count all 150 residents that were in the shelter the night of the count. According to the count, 108 or 32% of homeless persons are chronically homeless, compared to 105 or 34% in 2009. A number of homeless adults counted increased from 218 to 305, and the number of homeless children increased from 57 to 80. The number of seniors increased from 21 to 38. To summarize, at this time, LASA does plan to contract with Imago to operate the winter shelter program at the Glendale National Guard Armory for the 2010-2011 winter season. Historically, the City of Glendale and the Glendale Homeless Coalition have supported the Glendale Armory winter shelter program. Although every year it is a challenge and there are impacts to the community, which the city and the operator address to the best of their ability. Staff recommends that the council continue to support the LASA County-sponsored program at the Armory and direct staff to continue to work with LASA and the county towards the development of a local winter shelter program for the 2011-2012 winter season. And staff would also like direction from the council regarding the use of the various funding sources that have potential. With that, we can take questions.
Jim wants to talk. Okay, thank you, Mr. Duran. Mr. Weaver?
Jess, try to summarize all that. To do our own program, approximately $151,000. Right now, all our money in CDBG is already spread out like to projects like Path Achieve, right? Okay. So we would either have to reallocate some of that money in future years, go to the general fund. What other? Starbird?
Yeah, can I jump in here with a supplemental comment about that specifically? I frankly think funding is going to be much lower down on the challenges we face for the program. I think with clearance from you to proceed, I think the top two most difficult items would be the operator and the location, and one of those has been solved. And I think we'll address the location. We need to do more work, obviously, but I think funding is probably going to be one of the lesser problems. The ability to potentially reduce our winter homeless population. What we've seen is what we've always feared, and frankly the numbers were never really supported in the past, and that is that our winter shelter has become a magnet. Glendale's always been willing to serve its own and frankly take on some additional communities' problems. But it's gotten to the point that serving our own is the minority, a small minority, and addressing regional problems has become a significant component of the program. And we hear it from the businesses. We experience it ourselves at the ARC, at the Central Library. And it seems to me it's time to pull back and tell LASA, listen, we've done our share. Other communities have to step up to the plate. We're willing to continue to carry our burden and deal with our residents and homeless, and frankly, maybe even still take a little bit beyond that. But there's got to be more people who come into the picture. You'll recall the county program 5 years ago. The county launched a fairly significant strategic effort to address homelessness through regional centers. That's gone nowhere, absolutely nowhere. And so we find Burbank, who was courageous and stepped into the fold and did it for 2 years, they didn't like it. It's back in Glendale again with numbers increasing. So frankly, I think that the two key challenges are going to be location, and I would have said operator. I don't think funding is going to be a problem. I really don't. I think when we approach our neighbor to the west here, I think they'll be willing to contribute. I haven't talked to them, but I suspect they will. They developed a bit of a conscience when they were housing the program themselves. And I suspect that we'll be able to turn to the business community and get support as well, given that that effort will help us reduce the number of homeless that are coming to Glendale and, frankly, staying in Glendale. So I think we should make it clear to LASA that, okay, we'll do the regional program another winter, but, let's put it on the record that this is the last winter that Glendale is going to be a regional center, because the cost of the community is just too great. It's just become too great. We'll continue to shoulder our share and maybe even a little bit more, but the regional program continues to cost the community too much. I think it's your staff's view we need to begin to pull back. I frankly wouldn't get too wrapped up in the funding, because I think that we'll be able to solve that between now and when we have to make commitments about the program. I think it's very doable.
Okay, now going back to what I was trying to concise down. You're indicating $151,000. Now, all our funds currently are spoken for unless we went for the general fund, correct?
Currently, yes.
Okay. And I think you said about 39% of those homeless are Glendalians, or at least they identify as Glendalians. Everybody else comes from somewhere else, Los Angeles, surrounding communities. Okay, so is it fair to ask all those communities to pay a fair share, say, based on the percentage that are coming from their communities? You break it all up, the sum of the parts might be, we put in 39%, LA, whatever was it, 49%? Is that feasible to do?
Councilman Weaver, under our local program model, we would target Glendale, Burbank, immediate area homeless individuals and families. So we wouldn't be hosting 150 families where we'd want to reach out and try to get support from.
That was going to be my next question. Can we turn people away? Can we say we'll only take them from Glendale, Burbank, and whatever close city that we choose to?
We would target Glendale and Burbank residents. If we have room, we won't turn anybody away. If there's room, they'll be let in.
Okay, but if there isn't room?
If we're at capacity, then we would make arrangements, working with LASA to have persons, have a way to have persons transported to other shelters that would be open and have space available.
Okay, because I'm looking at a way that everybody pays the fair share. If that's Burbank and Glendale only, what is the split on that or anybody else, and see what that dollar amount comes to. Once you say it, you say a certain percentage are chronically homeless, and nothing is going to help them really. They want to be out in the street, but they want warm shelter at night. Is that it? And I think you said that there's a percentage that are families, or is there any families coming in?
There would be families. Our goal would be the night that a family checks in, they'll probably have to stay in the shelter, but our goal would be to voucher them to a motel and to rapidly rehouse them within a couple of days into transitional permanent housing.
But I was looking at, with those coming in, even just Glendale and Burbank, the number you get to prioritize within that, families first, mothers and children, up high, chronically homeless that never want to be in, down low. Is that permissible, or are you violating some laws by saying who gets the priority?
Councilman Weaver, we would probably prioritize and target chronically homeless and families probably equally, because right now those are our HUD's highest priorities, are chronically homeless and families. So we'd want to be consistent with HUD.
Okay,
And we're so hopeful that we can get some funding from LASA, even though typically they wouldn't fund shelters that are independent from their system. And so I'm sure we would have to target chronically homeless and families.
those are things that you'll work on in the next year.
Yes.
We tell you to, and come back as you work through them.
Yes.
Get our blessing.
Yes.
Okay, so, okay, then I understand, as Ms. Stubbard said, the biggest hurdle is going to be location.
Yeah.
Nobody's going to want a winter shelter next door to them. We've been through this. I've sat here 14 years, and I don't know how many times we've been through this process. I frankly don't know where we're going to go in Glendale.
Yeah, as Mr. Starbury pointed out, this is actually the first time that we've been able to have a service provider indicate that they're interested and willing and able to work with us on this project.
Well, I'm sure they would, but still, finding the spot.
Yeah.
That'll be acceptable community.
Right.
These council chambers will be filled with people around it that don't want it.
Although if I can, I think, and this may be a little naive, I think one of the first places we should turn to is the Armory. They've run it before. I know they do it because state law says for LASA they're obligated to. There may be some opportunity there. I think we need to explore that. At the Armory and an operation one-third its current size isn't going to produce nearly the kinds of problems that we've had in the past. I mean, the Armory is a relatively good location. We've been through the search. Well, you remember, Mr. Weaver, you were on the council. We did a search all over the community. And there just aren't very many good places where it's acceptable. It's kind of where it already is. Even though people would like to see it leave, it continues to be the most acceptable location.
Are any of the parking lots around the Armory, could they be dual use? Fill up tents or whatever with heaters in the parking lot areas if we couldn't go into the Armory?
You might recall that when we last looked for a site, we went down that road, and by the time we met all the health and welfare requirements and building and safety code requirements, having a temporary facility was going to cost us as much as almost building a building. You might recall that, Mr. Duran. It was quite an extensive process, and we continued to get wrapped up into a lot of the building and safety issues. Temporary facilities were very, very costly and very difficult.
Good luck in finding a place.
Ms. Friedman.
Just a couple questions. When Path Achieve finishes their new building, what will the increase in capacity be from what they have now?
My understanding is that the capacity will not be increased. They will be able to separate singles from families, and that was one of the main features.
Okay, so they're not increasing the capacity.
They're not increasing the numbers of persons.
My other question was, I was disturbed to see under negative outcomes the last bullet point, which was that the operator did not consistently implement and enforce the good neighbor policy, such as not strictly enforcing the once and stay policy, the prohibition of possession of weapons, and the policy of encouraging clients to engage in case management rather than entering shelters for meals and showers only. So my question is, going into next year, what can we do to try to address some of this, and why were we not able to address it last year during the program?
Councilmember Friedman, we'll have to do a better job of getting a commitment from the service provider and working with LASA to help us enforce our local policies for how we want the Glendale shelter to be managed. We do have representatives from Imago, so if it's okay with you, maybe they can come in and answer that question as well.
Jess, this is the group that has been operating the winter shelter?
Yes. Imago not only operates the Glendale Armory, but they operate 3 other winter shelter programs. So they are one of the primary service providers for winter shelters.
Hi, I'm Betsy Kelly with Imago. I'm a little thrown off because this is, I think, one of the first times I've heard that there were situations like that. The only issue that had been addressed to us were things like people hanging out during the day, and we worked with Path Achieve to have their staff go out and outreach during the day to the best of the ability, because our operation is only from 3 until 8 in the morning, so we're not available during the day. But as far as our policy on, it is a no weapons. People aren't, if it's an illegal weapon, we confiscated and call the police. If it's a knife or something that they use throughout the day, it's held and they can take it when they leave. It's not depending on the size. I mean, if it's a legal thing that they're allowed to use, they do that. And we have, I can't 100% address the policy of people coming and going, because we can't force anyone to stay. So if they choose to leave, it's not a jail. They're allowed to leave if they want to. And typically we inform, if they're leaving hostile, we inform the police department. But if they just decide, I'm not staying here, I'm leaving, is there anywhere else we can take you? We have bus tokens, we can get you somewhere else. But we can't force anybody to stay. But we do our best. I mean, it's a population that is high needs, so there are situations that we work to deal with as the best that we can. And we continue to work with the support of Yvette and her team, and I think it's a really great partnership.
Thank you. I certainly can appreciate the difficulty of what your task is. So this was not at all a question to try to put you on the spot, but
Yes.
But it does concern me that staff felt that there was a list of problems that you seem unaware of.
Yeah.
So I don't know why there's this disconnect. If they had this list of sort of negative outcomes, why you weren't made aware of it.
Well, I'm sorry. It could be because I'm just taking over a part of the ownership this year, so it could have been to the person who was before me that didn't know that, but I would have typically heard that because I was managing them. So it is, I'm a little shocked by
Okay,
it.
thanks. So, Mr. Duran, why is it that the operator doesn't know that the city thought that they had some negative outcomes?
Our liaison is Carrie. What's Carrie's last name? Is Carrie Gatlin, who wasn't able to be here today. Otherwise, she would have been able to address this as well. But we do have, as I mentioned earlier, we do have a subcommittee comprised of the departments and the operator and representatives from City of Burbank, and we do meet once every 2 weeks during the winter shelter season, and we do discuss issues that are coming up. We do discuss management issues and the impacts and things like this, and we try to develop strategies to address them together. We do need Imago to continue to commit to work with our police department. For example, if we have repeat offenders, if we have individuals that are going in and as soon as they eat and shower, they leave, because that's not the way the shelter program is supposed to operate, then eventually we would like to be able to have them on the list and be able to deny them services. And again, to work with LASA to make sure that that's okay with LASA, and I think it is, and with the operator to make sure that they enforce that policy if that's what the committee determines is the best approach to take with these types of issues.
Thank you.
Mr. Draymond.
Well, let me start off where Ms. Friedman ended, because I saw that too, circled it, underlined it, and have questions about that. It's not enough for me, just to put it absolutely bluntly, it's not enough for me as an elected official in the city to simply say, when it's something as serious as not consistently implementing and enforcing policies that include the prohibition of possession of weapons, that we simply say, yeah, let's go forward, we'll just try to do this a little better. That's not acceptable. I'm sorry. That doesn't work for me. I don't know who may or may not agree with me up here or out there, but it doesn't work for me at all. I have some concerns. I look at this report, and let me tell you where I'm coming from before I get into some of this. Jess, you can have a seat. This isn't directed at you. It's I don't think there's anyone on this dais, and I know I fall into this same category. I mean, it is tough to appear to be turning your back as an elected official on people that are in need at any time of the year, especially in the winter, when those people in need are facing, extreme climate issues, extreme cold, and so on. But I also have to be thinking about some other factors as well. Are we doing the best we can do to service homeless in our city, as opposed to homeless in Los Angeles? and homeless in the surrounding region, who, because we are in this program with LASA, we've opted into, we are compelled to, if we have open beds, build it and they will come, Also, you can't simply close your eyes to the impact it has on quality of life to some of our residents and to our businesses, who also indirectly pay for all this. And so I look at these positive outcomes, list of positive outcomes and list of negative outcomes, and I got to tell you, when I read this report, I felt my eyebrows disappear somewhere behind my ears. They went up. So the positive outcomes, anyone in the audience can play along or on the dais. Raise your hand when you hear me read a positive outcome that is related to the city of Glendale. Okay? First positive outcome. The Glendale Burbank Winter Shelter has resulted in basically a better collaborative joie de vivre between Glendale and Burbank. Is that why we have the winter shelter? Is that why that's a positive outcome? Because it's helped make Glendale and Burbank as cities get along better? Don't think so. The second one listed as a positive outcome, Path Achieve Glendale provided community outreach and education to business owners. Well, Path Achieve does a fantastic job in this city. But we're sort of creating the issue and asking them to go out and do public outreach, which they did. Of course they did. But I'm not sure that's a positive outcome of this. If they weren't doing that, they'd be doing what Path Achieve normally does, their own normal good work. The third item on the positive outcome list is Path Achieve Glendale provided intensive case management services at Path. Well, of course they do. They always do. I'm not sure how our hosting the winter shelter and Path Achieve being placed in service or stepped up service as a result is a positive outcome for Glendale. The city of Burbank contributed $20,000 for transportation services so that people needing beds from that area would be coming here. I'm not sure how that's a positive outcome for Glendale. Burbank reported no arrests or issues related at the pickup or drop-off location in Burbank. That's terrific for Burbank. Burbank Temporary Aid Center, the BTAC, supported outreach efforts to Burbank residents and provided case management services program. I'm not understanding how those are positive outcomes for this city, its residents, its business, or its homeless population. The negative outcomes. The Glendale Police Department reported increased numbers of arrest and incident reports at the Armory. So then it goes on to explain what those are, and I look at it, and it caused me to place a call to a representative from the Glendale Police Department to ask some questions. And I see Mr. Lorenz is here, Sergeant Lorenz, so I'd like to ask him some of these questions, if I may. I don't know if you're prepared to answer them, but I'd like to ask them anyway on the record. It basically is talking about a time period from December 1st to March 15th. We have the winter shelter here. Okay? And if I'm understanding it correctly, and this is on the pages, I think it's page 6. But in any case, it lists a bunch of locations: the Americana, Adult Recreation Center, the Armory, the Library, Central Library, the Marketplace, the former Gourmet 88 restaurant, and the strip mall that they're referencing on Colorado Boulevard. Okay?
Yes.
It indicates that the second column of calls is 337 calls, or 39% of the call, 39%. So, are those? I mean, is that a large number? We consider that a lot of calls in.
I'd have to look at. I haven't even looked at this report, but I'd have to look at the date of operation. I can tell you about some dozen years ago, I was the sergeant in the community policing unit and had to deal with this issue. And I remember standing here, Don, I think you were on this board way back then, and I dealt with the issues. But any increase in calls for service is significant to the police department. And this small area right here, that is a large number. And actually, if you look at those numbers, if you extrapolate it out to what potential impacts are for the quality of life and I happened to talk to Sergeant John Gilkerson this morning, who runs the COPS unit, is most of their issues dealing with these types of calls are quality of life issue calls, and 70% of our work related to these types of calls become more social than criminal.
All right. Then it shows 79 reports of those calls, 79 that were, I guess, specifically related to homeless or transient. Do we make a distinction between homeless and transient?
That's an interesting question, and the way we look at it in the police department, if you're homeless, you're without a home, but we look at the homeless in Glendale as Glendale residents, but yet they're homeless. We look at transients as those individuals that are transient to our community, which means they come into our community for a purpose and they move on. We had an incident not too long ago where we had a transient. He was arrested for burglary, but he did not live in the city. I call that a transient, even though he is homeless.
Well, then I see that 66 of those ended up being arrests. And these are reports and calls, according to the report anyway, are not duplicates. So it's not multiple people calling about the same person or the same incident.
It does not appear. Like I said, I haven't actually reviewed this report.
That's what this report says.
Okay.
I notice a little further down where it says fire, medical, emergency calls related to the same deal. It's the same area. It says Glendale Fire Department reported a total of 46 calls involving the winter shelter and in the immediate area surrounding the shelter, roughly the same time period. Of the 46 calls, 20 were calls to the armory itself and 26 were calls to the immediate area surrounding. There were a total of 79 calls. That's the exact same number listed as reports. So I want to know, do you roll out as dual agencies for this?
Yeah, that's actually probably just a major significant coincidence. There are many times, though, when there is a person down call that comes in on a 911 call, it'll first go. All 911 calls are received by the police department. Every single 911 call comes to the police department, medical emergency or otherwise. When that call is taken by our police dispatcher and it's a medical emergency, they will transfer that call to fire, but our dispatcher at the police department stays on the line, and we listen, and we will obtain the location and the condition of the individual, and we will immediately dispatch a police car because we're 24/7 and we usually get there. And when it deals with a person that's a transient or a homeless individual, and unfortunately, in many occasions, we're dealing with some maybe criminal behavior, that being a person under the influence of alcohol or drugs. And I know the fire department would appreciate the fact that we're there when they arrive. So I think the numbers being exact, I think that's a coincidence. But I can tell you, we had a transient call the other day where actually he was a pedestrian that was hit, and both fire and police rolled on it together on two separate occasions.
So basically then, the cost of operating the shelter to the city is, and this is where I'm headed with all of this, it's larger than just operating the shelter. There's a cost in terms of, our public safety assets as well, fire, medical, police, and it sounds like it is a significant one. Let me ask you this, two other questions, and then I promise I won't bother you anymore. At least today. Do we have any I see these statistics. Do we have any statistics that are for the rest of the year so we know whether how this compares? Because it may be in the report, but I didn't see it. So in other words, 337 calls, 79 reports, and 66 arrests out of that 79. How does this relate to that same area?
I don't know if that was done this year. I actually had an inquiry into Sergeant Gilkerson this morning, and he is off today on a whole other issue, but it kind of related to calls for service. I can tell you in the past, it was a roller coaster ride. Usually you don't see a decrease in calls for service until a few months later after the shelter closes, and you don't initially see high calls for service at the beginning of the opening of the shelter. It's sometime afterwards.
But your answer implies that you see a spike when the shelter opens.
That we do.
You do. Okay. And last question. Do you know whether we have any statistics or data that will tell us when this additional population that comes from other areas because they're open beds?
I'm sorry.
Is there data that you all have, and let me broaden it to also the city manager, if I can find out, does the city have any data that tells us when through this LASA program, in other words, homeless come to fill beds from other areas? So we have, according to the data in the report, there's a large number that come from Los Angeles. So they come here. How many of those people, after the shelter closes, go back to Los Angeles or stay here? Or is this how, in other words, is this how our homeless population is growing? Because Mr. Duran, in going through the report, indicated that as a result of the shelter, the winter shelter, the population is growing and growing, and you're also telling us that we see a spike when the winter shelter is open of issues of crime and arrests. So,
do we have data? No, I don't have any empirical data that I know of that specifically tracks whether or not or how long someone stays. I do know that during the shelter, there is a survey that's usually done every year, and I think it's still done, that asks those that come into the for services at the Armory, where did you come from, how long have you been here, where do you intend to go, how did you find the city of Glendale, et cetera, and so on. I know there is a report that's provided to the Housing Authority every year, but I have not seen that one this year.
Okay. Thank you, Sergeant Lorenz. Mr. Mayor, or did you have...
I was just going to add, Mr. Drammond, you were kind of doing a column of costs. We also have direct costs that we incur. The library, for example, probably spends in the neighborhood of $40,000, $50,000, $60,000 a year on private security services, not to mention their staff time that's engaged in dealing with a homeless population that tends to be at its peak during the winter shelter period of time. The ARC in our facility there, I know they deal with homeless issues throughout the year. My guess is that peaks during the winter shelter program. Of course, it's also inclement weather, so there's more tendency for even the Glendale homeless to want to use those facilities.
It does at times, and we have them in the parks as well, in Central Park. And we do.
It is interesting trying to get to, maybe Jess has some information on your last point, which was sort of how do we discern between the Glendale homeless and the non-Glendale homeless. I note that the homeless count is done in January, which is right in the heart of the cold weather shelter. Do we ever do a count, say during the summer? Jess, do you know, to get a sense of how many homeless are really here, I guess you could assume are here because of services, as opposed to those who are here all year long? Do we have a sense of that?
Mr. Starbird, no, we don't. We only do a homeless count in January per HUD guidelines. And I think HUD purposely wants to know what is the count during the highest peak period in any community, and it would be in January when homeless persons are most likely to want to get off the streets and avail themselves of services. The homeless count includes counting persons in transitional housing shelters and emergency shelters, so it's not just literally people on the street, but it's people availing themselves, that happen to be availing themselves of services. Now, our anecdotal observations are that most people that don't have roots in Glendale or identify themselves as Glendale or the surrounding areas do typically go back to wherever it is they consider their their home to be. So they do use the Glendale Winter Shelter, then many of them go back.
So if we took a count in the summertime, we'd expect it to be considerably lower.
It would be considerably lower.
Okay. Which also helps explain why the arrest rates spike.
Right.
Well, let me just say, Mr. Mayor, and that I absolutely would support us creating a local shelter. And when we come to that discussion, I would really like to get some kind of input from our public safety agencies, from police and from fire about that, some kind of recommendations. But I absolutely support that. I understand that for the next winter, we, as Jess mentioned, we need to continue. But I would very strongly support that we move to a joint program with Burbank if they're willing. We will save money for one thing, and we will do a better job, I think, particularly with the operator that's been identified or has come to us in serving our homeless population. This is an extremely difficult topic because, again, I don't want to sit here and say, you know, Glendale homeless versus other regions homeless. We're not interested in them. Socially, when I'm not on the dais, when I'm not wearing my city hat, that would probably be my philosophy and so on. But I also have to look at the bang for the buck and the issues of our residents, the issues of our business who pay for all of this for Glendale, and how effectively we're helping those on the streets here without adding to those numbers. In any case, those two elements at this point I would certainly support.
Okay, thank you. I appreciate those comments and those questions, Mr. Starbird, yours as well, and the report from Mr. Duran. So we've got several items before us. One is to acknowledge the receipt of this report. Second is to approve the release of an RFP for this winter, the 2010-2011, in the current configuration and size and scope. The third, which is what you just touched on in terms of us giving direction to staff to return with a program which serves mainly the needs of the homeless in the Glendale and Burbank areas for the winter shelter, and to discuss that item a little more fully and look at the different options, funding, location, service providers, etc. That's what I'm hearing, and that's what I do support, Mr. Drain.
Yes, Mr. Mayor, your motion actually notes 4 different funding sources. I just assume the funding sources remain general in nature. That we should explore any and all sources of funding to support a local program, and not limit it to these 4.
Not to limit it.
Yeah.
Okay, that's... Are there any other comments from agency members? Ms. Kelly, you had submitted a card to speak, and we didn't really...
That's okay. It was basically to reiterate and tell everybody, first and foremost, that we were really excited last year to be able to participate with Glendale, and it was a great city to work with, and we totally want to thank you for the support that you gave us in the past, and we're thrilled that we're able to do it again in the future. And we were working really close with everyone in the city, and you do a great job working with your homeless population. Yvette does a great job. We worked with the fire department and the police department, had them, like when the increased calls came in, had them come and kind of do a little teaching and class to our guests on what an emergency call is, and they were all very willing to come and support and help, and we just wanted to thank you for all the support.
Thank you. Thank you for coming forward. So this is a council motion, and it'll incorporate, the third part will be the direction as enunciated by Mr. Drayman and clarified by the
Mayor.
city manager.
And the mayor.
I'm sorry. Well, I sort of put it, wrapped a bow on it, as well as receiving the report and approving the release of the RFP for this winter season.
And I want to make sure I understand, we're only talking about Glendale and Burbank, period.
That was the direction.
Yes, Mr. Mayor, members of the council, the motion before you at 1A, we just essentially minor modifications. One, there is an error, and it states, at least the first part, but the council acknowledges receipt of the report is correct. The latter paragraph says housing authority should be the council, because it is a council motion. Further direct staff regarding the winter shelter. The only modifications I believe I'm hearing is that staff is directed to pursue the establishment of a locally operated winter shelter with the city of Burbank, and that it will explore any and all funding sources.
Okay. Is there?
I'll make that.
Make that,
I'll
Mr.
second the motion.
Seconded by Mr. Quintero. Mr. Duran?
Mr. Mayor, I think we need to make one more modification. Technically, the LASA has already given the award to Imagos. LASA did not do an RFP this year. They just renewed last year's contracts.
So we don't need to release the RFP. Will the proposal be coming before us to approve the contract?
No.
No, it's just an extension.
Mr. Mayor, we might note that the council approves and supports LASA's program for cold winter shelter for the 10-11 program year.
Okay. All right, so we'll make that. Mr. Weaver, do you adopt that?
Yes.
Change, and
Aye.
Mr. Quintero. Roll call, please.
Council members Draymond,
Yes.
Friedman,
Yes.
Quintero,
Yes.
Weaver,
Aye.
Mayor Najarian.
Yes. Is that the only item on this agenda? Is there a motion to adjourn for council?
So moved.
Second.
Council's adjourned.
A motion to adjourn for the Housing Authority.
Second.
We're adjourned.
Who was the motion for the House?